Charsep 9. This video gives some additional information and details on Charsep. This is targeting advanced users that have been through the other videos already. Let's look to some features of the grid that we did not explain earlier. We did explain how find, select, and search and replace dialogues were working. The contextual menu that you open with right-click on Linux and Windows, or Control-click on Macintosh, does provide some other functions. If you have only one row selected, for instance, you have an option to directly display on screen this row. This function does not look relevant when you deal with a small file, but if you have hundreds of thousands of rows, scrolling the grid to find this selected row is not that easy. If you have multiple rows selected, the same option will allow to navigate around these rows, moving to the previous one, or to the next one. If you have many rows displayed on screen, moving to the next row does not really make sense, so if you right-click on a selected row, Charsep will take into account this position to show you the selected row after this one. Another option of this contextual menu is to define a multi-columns sort order. You remember that by clicking in headers, you can sort the grid by the column. But you may want to define a multi-columns sort. Using the multi-columns sort dialog, you can select more than one column, and for each, if ordering is ascending or descending. The column's headers, in a multi-sort, will display in green. Actually, you can see the exact order of sorting because headers will go from deeper green, the primary sort, to a slightly lighter green. Sometimes you need to rapidly copy rows, to interact with Excel, or to paste in a text file. If no row is selected, you can copy all rows in clipboard, with tab used as the default separator and UTF-8 as code page, since it allows direct paste in Excel. If some rows are selected, the option will transform into selected rows copy only. But remember, the export function has much more options to select headers or not, only specific columns, and so on. Next option we will look into is to check differences between rows. Usually we use it on two very similar rows, but you can check differences between more than two rows. The dialog displays a transpose of the rows, since it is easier to check vertically. The first selected row is the reference. Any difference in value on the other rows will display in blue. You can also filter this dialog, to only show the columns that contain differences, or to only show the columns that are equal for these two rows. Let's sort the grid by city, to see some features of the distinct values dialog. By right-clicking any column, you can immediately get the total number of distinct values for this column, as you can see on the various columns I'm currently clicking on. But if we show the distinct values, and select some rows in this dialog, you have the total count of rows that have the values you select. This can support a typical use case of selecting the 80% of rows that fit top values. Let's sort the values by most used values. Then, I select rows, until I reach over 80% of content. When clicking OK, all the rows that contain these values get selected, so I know that the current selection 80% of the file, which contains the most used values for this city column. Let's look again the distinct values, for another column. This time we will select ABC classification. If you are interested to select rows that contain the only top used value, another possibility is to double-click this value from the dialog and it will immediately close and select the relevant rows. The last option of the contextual menu is informative and displays the number of selected rows and total number of rows of the grid. This information is similar to what you can see in the bottom of the main window. But by selecting this option, you can also open a separate window, to keep the selected rows for reference, or for future usage. And you can open such windows as much as you want. Actually, you understand that the grid object is at the core of Charsep development. And this object is used to expose the content of files, but is also used whenever the application displays a grid, so when you get used to it, the advanced features it provides can help you for many different purposes. For instance, when looking at the distinct values of column city in the grid information, you can further select the distinct values of occurrences. From this grid, you can sort and select the most present value, 14 in this case. Double-clicking on this row will select on underlying table, which means selecting the cities that are present 12 times and therefore part of the most representative distribution in the original file. Or, as a different use case, if we look at another place of the application, for instance we can check the grid control proposed rules from the wizard with 95% accuracy. And here, on the proposed rules, if I right-click and check the distinct values for min and max values, I can check if the same rule appears more than once. As you can see, we have two columns that fit the same format based on the rules proposed. Beyond the grid object, let's now look at different elements we did not cover yet. You remember the first column of the grid is not coming from the source file but just an indicator on row count. This indicator is not updated systematically when you resort the grid, so you can come back to the initial sort. However, you may be interested to force this renumbering, to have the row position aligned with the selected sort. Another tool proposed with Charsep is to display the list of character sets supported by your computer. In the Help menu, or using Ctrl-L, you can display this list. Sometimes the same character set is identified with different names or aliases. Fourth column in this dialog will give you information about these synonyms. And since this is displayed in a grid window, remember that you can always do a search. Here for instance we are looking at a specific code present in many charsets, and display the result in yet another window. Finally, let's have a look at a dialog that is not often checked by users, the About menu. In Charsep, the About Charsep menu will give you some details on the version, but also some technical information on the Java virtual machine that was used to launch the application, and operating system code. And beside this information you can actually configure some options of the tool. You can select, for instance, a different look and feel or skin for your tool. Charsep, beyond the standard look and feels embedded in your Java installation, includes some modern layouts like Flat Darkula or IntelliJ style. When selecting the traditional Nimbus look and feel, you can also decide to have a dark mode called Black Nimbus. From this dialog you can also select a different font size for the grids, or if you want to show lines or columns separators. To get these options in full effect, you will need to restart the application. Font size for the grids can also be changed on the fly, using Control mouse wheel when hovering any grid. The last option of this About dialog is to display the memory allocated to the tool, and how much is available on the memory heap. Clicking this button will call a memory garbage collector, so after massive processing of data on a grid, you may want to perform this garbage collection that can help recover some memory for further processing. This ends our tutorial on advanced hints and features. I hope you will enjoy using Charsep for many common tasks.